Hi, I'm Cathy McGinnis, and I did the Mental Ray for Maya Optimizations class. My background is more artistic than technical, however I do happen to have a lot of technical. I worked for years at Alias, and then I left in 2004, went overseas, worked in New Zealand for a while, worked at Weta Digital, and then I came back in September, I think it was, of 2007, so I've been back at Autodesk for about a year now. You know, there's certain books that I read that are really inspirational. For instance, Pixel Cinematography, which I believe was a white paper that was done about 10 years ago by a bunch of different people. I think someone from Blue Sky, someone from Pixar contributed to it. And when you read something like that, you kind of realize how important it is that what you put into your render in terms of color and light and things like that are really important to help drive the story. So, you know, just basic kind of artistic things, regular fine art is a really big inspiration for me. Some of the readings that I would recommend in terms of Mental Ray or Mental Ray for Maya, there is the there's the blue Mental Ray rendering book that is actually put out by Mental Images. That's really good, a very good reference. There's the Los Angeles Mental Ray Users Group. They have a website, and there's a whack of papers and, you know, and forums and stuff like that that are up there that you can go to, and there's really good advice up there. And then recently there was a book that was put out by, I'm going to get his name wrong, Boaz something. His last name starts with an L. It's got a picture of an airplane on it, and it was just released, I guess, maybe about 6 months ago. And that's a really good book because what it does is it kind of bridges the gap between Mental Ray itself and Maya. So for instance, in Maya, the Mental Ray attributes are sometimes called something different. So he says, okay, you know, Mental Images calls it this thing, Maya calls it this thing. And the same for 3ds Max and Softimage as well. So he goes through all three renders and how they relate to what the attribute naming convention is for Mental Ray. So I guess if I were to offer any kind of advice in terms of, like, you know, what the big takeaways would be, I'd have to say that if you're going to be tuning your renders, start low and increase in small increments, because a lot of times some of those small increments or larger increments can actually mean a lot in terms of render time. So you may see good quality, but you may take a hit with your render times. So just be, you know, aware of how things work. That's the other thing, is you kind of need to know how things are working under the hood in order to be able to make an educated decision about how to tune different things. If you don't need something, turn it off. There's a lot of attributes that are turned on by default, so you might want to go through and turn them off. So, you know, if you've got geometry, for instance, that's not casting a shadow, you'd want to turn that off. If you don't need ray tracing, you could turn that off. So just kind of be aware of what exactly is going on in your scene and then adjust accordingly. So with the Rasterizer, I think the Rasterizer is probably one of the least renderers that people use, maybe possibly because people don't understand what it does. So in the class I had explained a little bit about how scanline, anti-aliasing and shading calculation works. And then I talked a little bit about the Rasterizer calculation, and I had mentioned that the way that it works is the Rasterizer doesn't actually sample in the traditional sense of sampling a triangle or a pixel or what have you. So what happens is the geometry is tessellated as usual. Each triangle gets a sample, so we figure out what the color of the triangle is, and then that is cached with the geometry. So that's why the Rasterizer is a good sort of render to use for motion blur, because when you motion blur, that information just travels along with the object, so it's not constantly resampled. So the Rasterizer doesn't actually sample. It deals with triangles. Okay, and so that's what the shading quality and the visibility sample do, is they deal with the triangles. Like, how many triangles should we be looking at? How many triangles should we be considering? You know, each animation in each scene is different, so you never should really sort of treat them all the same. So a lot of times what people will do is they'll go down to the production quality and leave it, and that's not what you should be doing. That's fine to go to production quality, but you need to adjust it, and you'll find that each scene is different. The other thing is, you know, when we look at motion blur, You know, you can adjust your motion blur fine with, you know, single frame test renders, and that's fine, you know, testing the quality and trying to smooth out the blur, but your ultimate test is going to be this sequence. So you may actually be able to get away with low quality motion blur with, you know, not a lot of smoothing of the blur, and if that's the case, if you can get away with that, you should be doing that, because you'll save immense times in the render times. So when you're tuning your motion blur, make sure that you test render sequences and not just stick with, you know, just single frame renders, because it'll look totally different once you actually go to render. Okay, so some of the other really good influences in terms of you know, sort of artistic renderings and things like that is you need to look at directors of photography or cinematographers work, especially those that have come before us, because essentially we're doing the same thing. So we really don't need to reinvent the wheel. We kind of already know a lot of stuff from some of those guys. So there's a really good DVD. It's called Visions of Light, and it goes through cinematography right from the very beginning up until about, I guess, 1990. So you can see the different, you know, different styles of directors of photography and how they work to kind of push the script along and to talk about the mood of the movie and what they do in terms of framing something and also lighting something. So that DVD was quite inspirational. The other thing too is, you know, with the Pixar movies, they, you know, they really get it, like they really get the storytelling aspect of it. They don't rely on heavy duty special effects and huge technology and stuff like that. You know, if they can do it very simply, they do, but their renders are just fantastic. Like if you look at Cars, there was a scene in Cars where I think the cars were going down the highway at night, and it looked like it was a desert. It's been a while since I've seen it. But anyway, so it was like this nighttime highway scene, and I was with my son at the time, and he's like 10 or whatever, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, wow, this is like so cool, it looks so real, but it's 3D. And then my son leaned over to me and said, oh my god, I can't believe how real that looks. And I thought, wow, they've really nailed it. If they can convince a 10-year-old that that's really real, and you know, and help with that whole mood of, you know, what it's like to drive in a sort of deserted highway in the middle of the night, they really got it. So they really nailed it. So they really understand, you know, the framing aspect and the lighting aspect of and how that relates to the actual story. So one of the reasons, I mean, I've always been a Maya software render person, and it's kind of my niche, so I wanted to stay there. But once I came back after being away for 3 years, I thought, okay, well, now's the time to really get into the mental ray for Maya render. And I got to say, once you get in there and you really understand what's happening, it's not as scary as it might seem, because it looked pretty scary to me over on the Maya software side. But it's actually, there's certain things that are similar, and it's definitely something that's, you know, that is really good in certain situations. So for instance, the rasterizer, I found just over the last few months that using the rasterizer in fur is the way to go. And I'm not a fur person, and like fur's always kind of scared me as well, just because it looks very complicated. There's lots of attributes, it's slow to render. But if you bring that into mental ray and you understand certain optimizations that I talked about in the class, and you use the rasterizer, you can really decrease your render times with that.